Yo, 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 this Coach, no, sorry, this is not Coach Ray. This is King Ray coming at you. Just got voted Homecoming King this week, so we'll be referring to ourselves as King Ray. We will be doing simplifying radicals with I today, coming straight from the King. Okay? All right, two things you need to learn in this lesson. They're both in red up top. The only two things you need to learn today is one, that an imaginary number, the letter I, is the square root of -1. Okay, the only other thing you need to know is that I squared equals -1, and here's kind of how I want to show you that. I squared equals, we said I is the square root of -1, and if I multiply that by the square root of -1, that's what we're trying to figure out. Last week we talked about this. If I did square root of 5 times square root of 5, okay, it just ended up being 5. Because if you take a square root and square it, your square and your square root cancel each other because they're inverses, and you're just left with what's inside. Okay, so getting back to our problem here, if I'm doing square root of -1 times square root of -1, your two square roots cancel each other out, then you end up with -1. So only two things you need to know today. You need to know that I is the square root of -1, and you need to know that I squared is -1. That's it. Everything else is prior knowledge. Should be an easy lesson. Okay? I'm going to move fast. Stop me or slow me down if I lose you. Oh, let's go. Okay, example 1, square root of -50. I can still break up square roots. Hold on. Scroll down. There we go. Nope. There we go. I can still break up square roots just like we did last week. And I don't know if it's obvious or not, but I'm going to start by doing this. If you have a negative under the square root, the very first thing I'm going to do is break off that negative by splitting it into whatever the number is times the square root of -1. Break off the -1, now it's a positive 50. Okay, so now we know how to mess with that 50. Okay, so as we start to simplify, because that's the directions, the square root of -1, you have just learned that the square root of -1 is I. So I'm just going to turn that into an I. Square root of 50, we have to simplify. That's what the directions said. Same thing we did last week. Break it into two square roots. Hopefully it's obvious that we're going to break it into square root of 25 and the square root of 2. Okay, square root of 25 is a whole number 5, so I have I times 5 times square root of 2. And the last step is just cleaning it up. Anything that's not in a house goes up front. Anything that is in a house goes to the back. Okay, and the only other thing I need you to know about I today is I is just like a variable x. Okay, so when we do I times 5, it would be the same thing as doing x times 5. We don't write it as x5, we write it as 5x. So same thing here. I times 5 is just 5i, and then I've got square root of 2. I don't need the dots in between anymore. That's it? Yay. The King makes it sound so easy. Okay, example 2, I'm going to keep moving. My negative out front of that square root is just like a -1 times that whole thing. Okay, so I'm going to start breaking this up, and I'm going to put my -1 out front instead of just a negative. I think that looks a little bit nicer. Then I'm going to break my square root of -48 up to square root of -1 times square root of 48. Okay, so if I ever have a negative underneath the square root, break it apart, or one of them ends up the square root of -1, the other one's a positive number. All right, so next step. I got -1 times square root of -1, you just learned is I. Okay, square root of 48, I want to break up to square root of 16 times the square root of 3. We messed with that last week. Okay, so now what do I got? I got -1 times I times square root of square root of 16 is a whole number 4. Okay, times the square root of 3. All right, time to clean up. All my non-house stuff goes out front. All my houses go to the back. So I'm going to have, I've got -1 times I times 4. -1 times 4 is -4. And then I just got my I, and then square root of 3. Okay? Okay, we're moving. Let's do this. Excuse me. All right, example 3. I'm multiplying. There's a couple ways you can do this. I want to start with how I would do it, and then I'll kind of describe another way you could have attacked it. But I want you to write down the way that I'm going to do this right now for those of you that are copying on the notes. I'm going to break square root of -27 up into 3 things. Okay, I can break it up as much as I want. Hopefully one of them is obvious. I'm going to break off the -1. I don't want it to be negative. So I've got the square root of -1. times, I'm just going to go ahead and in one step break this up to square root of 9 times square root of 3. So negative 1 times 9 times 3 is square root of negative 27. Broke it up into three things. Okay, my square root of negative 3, I'm going to break up into two things. Square root of negative 1 times square root of 3. Remember, if anything's negative underneath the square root, I want to break off that negative 1. All right, let's start simplifying some stuff. We got square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 3 is nothing. Square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 3 is nothing. So far, so good. Move all non-house stuff to the front, all house stuff to the back. Okay, so let's see. Up front, I've got 3 times I times I. We've got 3 times I times I. So obviously, I'm going to have a 3. I times I is just like a variable x. If we were doing x times x, we would get x squared. So I times I is I squared. Okay, and then in the back, I've got square root of 3 times square root of 3. I can put those back together. Okay, so when I put those back together, I get square root of 9. Okay, we're not done. If you didn't recognize, in Alex, if you'd have plugged this in, they wouldn't have told you you're wrong. They would have just told you you're not simplified all the way yet. So hopefully you recognize that we can keep going. There's a couple things that can still happen here. My I squared, that was the second thing you needed to learn today. You needed to know that the square root of negative 1 is I, and you need to know that I squared is negative 1. So I'm going to switch. There's my 3. I'm going to switch my I squared to negative 1. And square root of 9 is 3. Okay, one more step to simplify. I just got 3 numbers multiplying together. Piece of cake. 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. Negative 3 times 3 is negative 9. There's our answer. Okay, the only thing I want to point out right now is this. Let's go back to the beginning of this problem and talk about this. When you see square root of negative 27 times square root of negative 3, your initial instinct might be to just put those back together. If you did square root of negative 27 times square root of negative 3, you would get the square root of positive 81. And then the answer would be 9, not negative 9. Okay, so the only point I want to make is this. You want to break off your negative 1s before you start putting stuff together. Okay, you want to put positive stuff together. You got to break off your negative 1s so that those turn into i's, and then everything else, if you want, you could put it back together. So how I could have done this is I could have broken the problem up to square root of, sorry, that's not what I want. Square root of negative 1 times the square root of 27 times square root of negative 1 times the square root of 3. And then if I wanted to, I could have put my this and this together, making it square root of negative 1 times square root of negative 1 times, that would be the square root of 81 when you multiply 27 times 3. So now, and I'll just move quickly, this would turn into I, this would turn into I, this would turn into 9, and now you can see how we're going to end up with our negative 9. And I times I would be I squared, and then I squared turns into a negative 1, and negative 1 times 9 would be negative 9. So you could have, the point I'm trying to make here is you could have put your 27 and your 3 back together, but do it after you break off your i's. If you do negative 27 times negative 3 and it turns into a positive, you just lost some i's that were supposed to be there. Everybody okay with that? Okay. Let me erase that so it doesn't look ugly. All right, last problem, example 4. I'm going to break up the top because I've got a negative under the square root. So I've got negative 1 times times square root of 24 all over the square root of 3. Okay, and the only thing I wanted to show you in this example is multiply and divide is the same thing. Okay, so if we can multiply square roots back together, then we can also divide square roots back together. As long as I broke off my negative 1 already, which I did. So since my 24 and my 3 are both positive, I can put those back together. Square root of 24 divided by the square root of 3 is square root of 8. So now I've got my square root of negative 1 times the square root of 8. Okay? As I start to simplify, square root of negative 1 is I. This is going to break up to square root of 4 times square root of 2. So when I simplify this, my square root of 4 turns into the whole number 2. This I goes right here, and then my square root of 2 goes in the back. So the only new thing I wanted to show you in example 4 was that you can also put them back together using divide, not just multiply. Okay, as long as you already broke off your negative 1, which is going to turn into I. Any questions on that? right, what another great video by King Ray. We're out. I'll see you next time. Deuces.